The first time I saw a face in the flash that didn't belong to anyone on my crew, I felt something in my chest twist, like a warning pulled straight from the ocean floor. Nobody told me the job came with 11 rules, each stranger than the last, and I learned fast that breaking even one can turn a simple photo into something that follows you long after the dive. I remember the first time I slipped and ignored a rule, thinking it was all superstition. But the camera proved me wrong in a way I still can't explain. And now I can't stop wondering why that face keeps getting clearer each time I take a picture. I learned the meaning of Rule 1. Never review a photo while you are still underwater. On the same night the trench currents shifted and left our diving cage swaying like a loose lantern. The sea around us looked calm through the thick windows of the descent pod, but the deeper we went, the more I felt the pressure building, like a hand closing around my ribs. My camera sat clipped to my vest, its cold metal tapping gently against my chest, as if trying to warn me. I kept telling myself it was just another routine dive, yet something about the darkness below felt heavier than usual. When we reached the lower deck of the habitat, the walkway lights were dimmer than I remembered, turning every corner into a suggestion rather than a shape. My partner for the night, Caden, walked beside me with his usual careless grin, but even he kept glancing over his shoulder as we made our way toward the gear station. The habitat walls always carried a low background hum from the generators, but tonight it had a strange unevenness, almost like the station itself was uneasy. I didn't comment on it, mostly because I didn't want to hear my own worry echo back at me. We suited up in silence, something neither of us ever did unless the dive felt off from the start. I secured my oxygen line, tightened my gloves, and checked the seals around my wrists and neck before grabbing my camera rig. The lenses were spotless, the battery fully charged, and the waterproof casing locked in place. Caden nudged me and asked if I was ready, but his voice sounded a little too loud in the quiet room, like he was trying to chase away a fear he hadn't admitted yet. I nodded anyway, pretending confidence would be enough for both of us. Outside the habitat, the ocean greeted us with its usual indifference, stretching out in a color so dark it felt closer to void than water. Our helmet lights carved out narrow tunnels through the black, barely illuminating the sandy trench bed ahead. Every step stirred faint clouds of silt that drifted upward like slow smoke, curling in patterns that vanished as quickly as they formed. Caden stayed a few paces ahead of me, scanning the surroundings with the relaxed posture of someone who'd done this too many times to stay tense. I wanted to match his calm, but something inside me kept tightening with every foot we descended. The mission was simple: photograph the new coral formation discovered earlier by one of the drone scouts. The images would help the biologists analyze structural changes, possible species nests, or anything unusual lurking inside. I had photographed hundreds of formations before, many stranger than this one, so there was no logical reason for the dread gnawing at my stomach. Yet the silence felt thicker tonight, as if the water itself was holding its breath around us. I kept adjusting my camera, not out of necessity, but to distract myself from how the darkness seemed to press in closer every time we paused. When we reached the marked location, I immediately noticed something the report hadn't mentioned. The coral wasn't just larger than before, it had grown in ways that didn't follow any predictable pattern. Branches curved into almost geometric angles, forming a shape that looked disturbingly deliberate. Caden made a low sound through the comms, a mixture of awe and discomfort, before circling to the far side to inspect it. I approached slowly, raising my camera and letting the automated focus adjust to the faint reflections shimmering off the surface. The growth pulsed with faint bioluminescent flickers, like veins shifting under skin. I took the first shot and watched the flash ripple across the coral, illuminating every strange ridge and fold. The light faded quickly, swallowed by the darkness, but it was enough to bring back the uneasy pressure in my chest. I took a second photo, then a third, adjusting the angle each time to capture the full scope. Something in my peripheral vision twitched, a fleeting silhouette that darted just outside the reach of the lights. I spun, scanning the void, but saw nothing except drifting silt suspended like dust caught mid-fall. My breathing grew heavier, uneven enough that I had to focus to steady it again. Caden's voice crackled through the comms, asking if I was seeing things too, but before I could answer, I noticed the coral had shifted. Not the entire structure, just a subtle angle of one branch, small enough that anyone else might have dismissed it as an illusion of light. I knew better. Coral didn't move. It didn't bend. It didn't rotate itself toward a source of sound or motion. Yet here it was, unmistakably pivoted toward me, as if reacting to my presence. A cold shiver traced its way down my spine, not from the temperature, but from the feeling of being watched. I moved closer to inspect it again, determined not to let my imagination take over, but the closer I got, the more I felt the weight of the deep settling on me. The branch that had shifted now pointed directly at my helmet, its glowing edges forming a narrow line that seemed almost accusatory. I raised my camera again, not to photograph but to shield myself from the feeling of exposure. Caden murmured that we should finish quickly and get back to the habitat, and I didn't argue. Every instinct told me we were staying too long. As I adjusted my position, my camera accidentally brushed against one of the coral ridges, releasing a faint vibration through my glove. It wasn't the rigidity of stone or the softness of plant tissue. It felt too warm, too responsive, almost like muscle tightening under pressure. I jerked my hand back, staring at the spot, half expecting it to pulse again. It didn't, but the lingering warmth against my glove made it clear that whatever we were studying wasn't just alive, it was aware. I felt a creeping dread crawl up my neck, settling beneath my helmet like a breath that wasn't mine. Caden suggested taking a final wide-angle shot before retreating, and though my gut screamed against staying any longer, I knew refusing would only make him reckless. He was the type to wander closer if he thought I was hesitating, and that was the last thing I needed. So I steadied myself, positioned the camera, and prepared the flash. The moment it went off, the brief burst of light revealed something behind the coral, not another fish or plant or drifting debris, something much larger and far too close to have approached silently. I froze without lowering the camera, every muscle locked as if the ocean around me had solidified. The shape behind the coral didn't resemble anything in our database. It was tall, narrow, and unsettlingly still, with a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Caden whispered my name through the comms, his voice barely above a breath, asking if I saw it too. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Part of me hoped the next blink would erase the image from my mind, but the shadow behind the coral remained centered in my memory, unmistakable in its wrongness. I wanted to look at the photo I had just taken. Every instinct screamed to check the screen, to confirm what I had seen wasn't just the result of fear skewing my perception. My thumb instinctively drifted toward the playback button, desperate for certainty. But the moment my finger brushed the edge of the camera, a cold realization shot through me like an electric current. I couldn't review anything down here, not without breaking the one rule I'd sworn to follow. Even without naming it, the weight of the rule pressed against my mind, reminding me that some images weren't meant to be seen where they were taken. The shadow shifted again, only slightly, but enough for me to understand that it wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. It was moving. It was aware of us. Caden whispered that we needed to retreat slowly, avoiding sudden motions that might draw attention. I followed him, taking careful backward steps while keeping my eyes fixed on the coral and the darkness behind it. The shape didn't approach, but it didn't retreat either. It stayed there, watching, as if waiting for something I didn't want to imagine. The moment we were far enough, Caden signaled the ascent, and I didn't hesitate. We moved through the water with steady, controlled strides, but the entire time I felt an invisible pull behind me, as if something followed just outside my light's reach. I fought the urge to glance back, terrified that doing so might encourage whatever was behind us. The ocean felt colder on the return trip, pressing harder against my suit, as if urging me to move faster. Every inch felt like a mile, every breath like a countdown. I couldn't stop. By the time the habitat came into view, my chest was tight enough to hurt. The bright entrance lights washed over us like a lifeline, and we hurried inside with a relief neither of us dared to voice. Only once the inner door sealed did I let myself breathe normally again. Caden leaned against the wall, his helmet still on, refusing to meet my eyes. I didn't speak either, too afraid that giving shape to what we saw might make it real in a way we couldn't undo. I unclipped my camera only when the final seal engaged, and even then my hands trembled enough to make the casing rattle. I wanted to check the photo more than I wanted to breathe. The temptation crawled over me like a second skin, urging me to press the button and end the uncertainty. But some part of me, the part that remembered what could happen if I looked too soon, forced me to wait. I wasn't ready. Not yet. And as I stepped toward the decontamination room, still fighting the urge to review the picture, I realized the real danger hadn't been out there in the trench. It was inside the camera, and it was waiting for me to look. Caden waited for me in the decontamination room, while I tried to keep my hands steady, but the camera felt heavier than it ever had, as if the device knew I was fighting the pull of curiosity. I reminded myself of Rule 2. Never let anyone else touch your camera after a deep dive flash, a rule I used to laugh at when it came up during training. But tonight it clung to my mind with a seriousness I couldn't ignore. Steam filled the chamber in slow waves as the air cycle began its cleansing routine, washing the cold grasp of the ocean from our suits. My breath fogged the inside of my visor, blurring Caden's expression behind the haze as he tried to read my mood. When the cycle finished, we stepped into the locker corridor, where the humming pipes overhead gave off a faint vibration that resonated through the metal grates under our boots. Caden finally pulled off his helmet and set it on the bench, rubbing his face hard as if trying to scrub off whatever we had seen out there. I unlatched my helmet more slowly, still gripping the camera with my free hand, keeping it close to my body as though it might slip away if I eased my hold. The corridor light flickered once, dimming just long enough to stretch my nerves thin before stabilizing again. I told myself it was a power adjustment, but doubt slipped in like unwelcome whispers. Caden asked me if I planned to check the photo now that we were safely inside, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. He moved closer, eyeing the camera with a curiosity that felt more intense than his usual casual interest. I angled my body slightly away from him without thinking, and he noticed the shift, raising an eyebrow at my guarded posture. The air between us grew tight, almost defensive, and I felt a sudden fear that he might reach for the camera in an attempt to lighten the mood or tease me out of my tension. For the first time in all our dives together, I didn't trust his instincts. We made our way to the common room where the lights were brighter, yet the brightness felt cold and clinical, doing nothing to ease the unease lingering from the dive. The station was quiet at this hour, most crew members asleep or occupying the far wings, which left the room feeling too open and too empty. Caden sat across from me at the table, leaning forward with his elbows braced against the metal surface as he tried to process everything that had happened. I kept the camera in my lap under the table, fingers resting on the casing like it was a fragile pulse. He asked again what I thought the shadow could have been, but even his voice sounded cautious, as though he feared naming it might invite it inside. I avoided describing the shape in detail, mostly because doing so made my skin crawl, but also because admitting how clearly I had seen it made the situation feel more real. Instead, I tried to steer the conversation toward the coral structure, pointing out the unnatural angles, the eerie symmetry, and the way one of the branches had subtly reoriented itself. Caden nodded, but his eyes drifted repeatedly toward my lap, drawn to the camera as though an unseen magnet pulled at his attention. I could feel the tension building, thin as glass, threatening to crack if either of us made a wrong move. The doorway to the corridor remained open behind us, leading into a dim stretch of hallway that seemed too dark for the time of night. Normally a soft amber glow lit the path, but now it looked as though a shadow had swallowed the middle section of the corridor, leaving only the distant end illuminated. The uneven lighting made it hard not to glance toward it again and again, expecting something to emerge. I shifted in my seat, trying to focus on Caden's words, but my gaze kept drifting toward the dark patch, my heartbeat picking up with every passing minute. There was a strange heaviness in the room, like the pressure of the deep had followed us inside. Caden cleared his throat and asked, more directly this time, if he could see the camera just for a moment. His tone tried to sound casual, but it carried an edge of insistence that made my grip tighten instinctively. I told him I needed a moment before I could look at the photos myself, and I wasn't ready to hand the device to anyone else. He frowned, leaning back in his chair, and the expression didn't suit him. He wasn't used to me shutting him out, and the sudden shift unsettled him just as much as it unsettled me. The silence between us stretched uncomfortably. He stood, pacing once behind his chair, as if trying to release the tension buzzing beneath his skin. The overhead lights gave his shadow a faint, distorted outline on the wall, making it look taller and thinner than it should have been. His shadow passed over the dark corridor entrance and seemed to blend into the deeper patch of darkness before stretching back toward him. The sight made something in my stomach twist, a reminder of the shifting silhouette behind the coral. Caden didn't notice my reaction, but I saw him pause briefly, as if sensing something wasn't right in the air. When he returned to the table, he leaned forward again, but this time with a wary seriousness replacing his earlier impatience. He said he wasn't sure what he saw during the last flash, only that it felt wrong in a way that didn't fit any deep-sea phenomenon we knew. I didn't want to admit I'd seen it more clearly than he had, yet the image kept replaying in my mind regardless. The shape behind the coral had been too distinct, too focused, its posture suggesting attention rather than aimless drifting. I wondered if it had turned fully toward me in the instant after the flash, waiting for me to break the rules and look. My pulse quickened at the thought, and I felt heat crawling up my neck as though the camera in my lap radiated something alive. The casing felt subtly warmer than before, a heat that seemed to seep through my gloves and settle into my palms. It made me uneasy, as if whatever had appeared in the flash was still present in some trace form, lingering inside the device. I wanted to place it on the table, put distance between myself and that faint warmth, but the idea of letting go made me feel exposed, as though the room would change the moment I released it. Caden leaned forward again, his fingers tapping lightly against the table, trying to mask a tension he wasn't ready to voice. He asked me one more time, quietly, whether I could hand him the camera for just a second. His tone carried something different now, not frustration, not curiosity, but an odd mixture of concern and yearning, as though he genuinely believed holding it might offer clarity. I locked eyes with him and felt a sudden sharp certainty that giving him the camera would be a mistake. The urge to say no sat heavy on my tongue, but the seriousness in his stare made the moment stretch uncomfortably. I took a slow breath and moved the camera further onto my lap, turning my body slightly so he couldn't easily reach it even if he tried. His shoulders tensed at the gesture, and he opened his mouth to say something, but the lights above us flickered again, this time longer and more intensely. The shadows along the walls stretched in strange directions, making shapes that didn't match the furniture or our bodies. Caden's shadow swayed in ways that didn't match his movements, lingering half a second behind like an afterimage, trying to catch up. I saw his face pale as he caught sight of it. The lighting stabilized, but the tension didn't fade. The corridor behind us remained unnaturally dim, and I became aware of a faint sensation, like a presence in the air, quiet but attentive. Caden straightened, glancing toward the hallway with a nervous shift in his posture, and whispered that he felt like we weren't alone. The words settled heavily in the room, stirring a dread I'd been trying to keep caged since the dive. Something about the station's atmosphere felt wrong, like the deep had followed us back step by step, refusing to be shut out by steel walls or air cycles. I tightened my grip on the camera, my heartbeat quickening as I felt another wave of warmth seep from the casing into my fingers. The knowledge that something might have imprinted itself inside the device made my skin crawl, yet the thought of letting someone else touch it filled me with an instinctive resistance I couldn't explain. I looked toward the hallway again, half expecting the shifting silhouette from the coral to step into view, but the darkness remained still. The stillness made it worse. Stillness meant waiting, and waiting meant intention. Caden exhaled sharply and took a step around the table toward me, not with aggression, but with the kind of determination someone gets when fear mixes with desperation. His hand lifted slightly, as if reaching for the device, and for a fraction of a second, I thought he might actually grab it despite my refusal. I pushed my chair back instinctively, the legs scraping softly against the floor as I created distance between us. The movement surprised him enough that he stopped mid-step, his expression wavering between confusion and worry. He whispered that he was only trying to help, but the way his eyes flicked toward the camera betrayed something else, a pull he didn't understand. I felt the unspoken fear between us thicken, turning the room heavy and suffocating. The camera pulsed with that strange warmth again, and I clutched it tighter, knowing with absolute clarity that letting anyone else touch it would be the wrong choice. Not just wrong, dangerous. Whatever had been captured in the final flash didn't want to stay confined, and passing the camera off felt like offering it an exit. The tension between us broke only when a distant metal shift echoed through the station, quiet but distinct enough to pull both our gazes toward the corridor. The sound wasn't mechanical malfunction or settling pipes. It was softer, slower, like something brushing against the inner walls with deliberate movement. Caden stepped back instinctively, and I felt the hairs on my arms rise beneath the suit's inner lining. The shadowed hallway remained still, yet the sense of being watched grew sharper, colder, more intrusive. Whatever waited in that darkness wasn't finished with us. He turned to me, voice strained, and said we needed to get back to the labs and check the systems for any anomalies. I stood slowly, camera held tightly, feeling its warmth pulse again like a heartbeat. The lights flickered once more, and the shadows shifted in a way that made my breath hitch. The station's atmosphere felt wrong in every direction, as though the ocean had seeped inside and settled into the walls. We moved toward the hallway together, but neither of us wanted to be the first to step into the dim section ahead. As we approached the darker stretch of corridor, the pressure in the air grew heavier, as if the water outside pressed inward with growing insistence. The camera felt almost alive in my hands, warming my palms with every passing second, and I kept it close to my chest like a shield against whatever lingered out of sight. The hallway's shadows didn't move, yet they held a sense of awareness that made each step feel like a risk. We paused near the edge of the dim section, both of us breathing slowly as we tried to steady our nerves. Then, just as I shifted my weight to step forward, a shape flickered at the far end of the hallway, tall, still, and unmistakably waiting. The corridor outside the lab felt tighter than usual. As I made my way back to the workstation, trying to convince myself I wasn't still imagining the thing I'd almost seen in the corner of the last frame. I kept thinking about Rule 3, never review the photos alone after midnight, repeating it in my mind, as if that would fix the unease crawling across my skin. Even though it wasn't midnight yet, the base already carried that late-night heaviness, the kind that made every step feel like it echoed deeper than the hallway allowed. I told myself I would only check the images for a minute, just long enough to prove nothing was wrong. But even then, the silence pressing against the walls felt heavier than anything I'd felt underwater. I pushed open the lab door, expecting darkness, but the overhead lights flickered faintly, as if they had been struggling to stay awake for hours. The workstation monitor glowed in the center of the room, left on by someone who had clearly forgotten to power it down, and the mouse moved slightly as though nudged by a draft I couldn't feel. I approached slowly, feeling the faint vibration of the base's machinery beneath the floor, a soft reminder that even miles beneath the ocean, metal had to keep pretending it was stronger than the pressure outside. Sitting in the chair felt wrong, like someone else had just been there, and the warmth lingering on the seat back made my breath stall in my throat. I clicked open the folder, watching thumbnails load with a sluggish, almost reluctant shimmer. The first images seemed normal: floating silk clouds, rock structures illuminated by the flash, a shadow from one diver passing a beam of light across the seafloor. But the deeper I scrolled, the more something felt misaligned, like the camera had captured something the lens itself didn't understand. One image froze longer than the rest, refusing to open, and when it finally did, the screen dimmed slightly, as if trying to hide what it was showing. The photo was taken from behind me, yet I had no memory of anyone being there, and the silhouette in the frame didn't look like any diver on our roster. The head was turned too far to the side, the neck twisted at an angle no gear would allow, and the faint shape of fingers curled around the edge of the viewfield suggested someone leaning close, almost curious. I leaned back, pulse beating like a slow drum against my ribs, and tried to rationalize what I was seeing, but every explanation fell apart the moment I clarified the image. The figure seemed to react to the motion, the face shifting slightly, not like a glitch, but like a person adjusting their expression. I closed the window quickly, suddenly aware of how quiet the lab had become, realizing even the hum of the overhead lights had softened into something thinner, almost expectant. The only sound left was my own breathing, and even that felt misplaced, like it belonged to someone standing just behind me, rather than me sitting at the desk. My hand hovered over the mouse, uncertain if I should continue or shut everything down and leave the lab entirely. Before I could decide, the monitor dimmed again, but this time the screen didn't show any folder or video feed. It showed the lab itself, from a corner I couldn't locate, some unseen camera angle I had never authorized or installed. In that reflection of the room, I could see myself sitting at the desk, frozen the way someone looks when they've been posed for a portrait they didn't want to take. But behind me, in the doorway, stood the same shape from the picture, only now taller, straighter, and turned more fully toward the camera. Its head had changed angle again, not bending but rotating, the motion so slow it made my stomach turn, like bones adjusting under waterlogged skin. I whipped around so fast, I nearly toppled the chair, but the doorway behind me was empty. My breath came in short bursts as I looked back at the screen, hoping the angle would reset or glitch away into static, anything to break the stillness of that figure staring from the feed. Instead, the camera angle shifted closer, as if someone behind it had stepped forward, and I could now see the edges of a diving mask around the figure's face. But the mask was cracked, thin fractures spiderwebbing across the glass, and behind those cracks, two faint gray circles watched with a sharpness I couldn't interpret as human. It didn't move, but the room around me seemed to pulse like the air was thinning, pressing me against the floor with a pressure I didn't recognize from the base's usual strain. I stumbled back from the desk, knocking over a stack of sample cases that clattered across the tiles, their scatter echoing like movement in a cave. The monitor brightened suddenly, casting shadows and shapes I didn't recognize, and for a moment I thought I saw a hand pressed against the inside of the screen itself, not pushing outward, just resting there, as if testing the thickness of the barrier between us. The fingers were long, slightly webbed, with faint ridges along the knuckles like scales that had tried to mimic human lines. I tore my eyes away, backing toward the wall, feeling the cold steel through my shirt like a grounding force that refused to help. The hum returned, louder this time, and I realized it wasn't coming from the lights or the machines. It felt like it was coming from the screen, a low vibration that settled in my chest and made my heartbeat stutter in its rhythm. The image on the monitor shifted again, now showing only the empty lab, no figure, no me, just the room in a stillness so complete it felt staged. I reached toward the power switch, forcing my shaking hand to move, but the screen flickered before I touched it, replacing the empty room with a single close-up of the cracked diving mask. The cracks spread slowly, widening like the glass was breathing, expanding with each second until the fractures formed the outline of a smile. That was when the alarm outside the lab blared in two short bursts, the emergency signal for personnel movement detected in an unauthorized zone. It wasn't a sound meant to scare, it was a sound meant to warn, meant to tell you someone was somewhere they shouldn't be. I didn't wait to check the screen again. I yanked the door open, and ran into the hallway, heart pounding, the echo of the alarm merging with the dim metal groan of the base shifting under pressure. But the moment I stepped into the corridor, the lights above me flickered once, then stabilized, and the alarm cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing in my ears I couldn't shake. Halfway down the hall, I realized something worse. The corridor had footprints on the floor, wet ones, leading away from the lab. They weren't mine, and they weren't shaped like any boot issued on the base. The trail led toward the observation deck, and even though every instinct told me to turn back, I followed, because the base only had so many places something could go. The lights dimmed in sequence as I approached, and the hum beneath the floor felt sharper, like the whole structure was holding its breath. When I reached the deck door, the window was fogged on the inside, streaked with moisture like someone had pressed their face against it. I leaned closer, hesitating, and saw a shape move behind the fog, slow and deliberate, waiting for me to come inside. The door handle was cold when I touched it, colder than anything in the base should have been, like it had been held by something that didn't carry human warmth. I pushed the door open with the slightest pressure, revealing the room inside. The observation glass looked out into nothing but dark water, yet something faint drifted past the window, a blur that watched me as it moved. On the console beneath the glass sat my camera, the strap damp, as if it had been submerged, and the screen on the back was still lit. It showed a new photo, one taken from right behind where I stood. The moment I saw the new photo on the camera screen, my stomach tightened as though I had swallowed a block of ice. I remembered Rule 4, never point your camera toward the observation glass after something passes by, and even thinking of it made my pulse double. The image showed the back of my head framed perfectly, centered as if someone had taken their time lining up the shot. The observation glass in the background was warped from the angle, bending the dark water into a stretched shape that resembled a mouth pulled wide. The room's cold air didn't match the warmth spreading across my neck, as I realized something had been standing right where I was now. I forced myself to breathe slowly, telling myself not to panic, but the faint reflection in the glass shifted, making me flinch hard enough to nearly drop the camera. I stepped farther into the observation deck, feeling the soft groan of the metal floor beneath me like bones moving under pressure. The fog on the glass had started to clear in patches, revealing the abyss outside in inconsistent trembling shapes. Something large drifted beyond the window, never close enough to see clearly, yet present enough to make the water seem thicker than usual. I kept the camera pointed down, gripping it tightly, afraid that even an accidental lift in the wrong direction would break the rule in the worst way. My breath clouded the glass near the camera screen, but the fog on the observation window remained untouched, as if the moisture had been placed there from the other side. I looked at the wet streaks again and realized they weren't random. They looked deliberate, like the path of a hand dragged slowly downward. A faint shift in the shadows outside made me step back until my shoulders hit the console. The movement wasn't fast or aggressive. It was slow, drifting, patient, like something circling a point of interest it hadn't fully decided on yet. The water beyond the glass held a density that made the shapes appear to pulse in and out of view, stretching as though the pressure distorted not only the ocean, but whatever moved through it. A tremor rolled through the base, a deep vibration that rumbled under my feet, and the lights along the ceiling flickered in response. I looked at the camera again, afraid of seeing another new photograph appear without my touch, but the screen had gone dark, the battery suddenly drained, as if something had drawn the power straight out of it. I placed the camera on the console slowly, not wanting to make any movements that might draw attention from whatever was outside. The observation deck felt too exposed, like every wall was one thin mistake away from letting the ocean swallow the room whole. My eyes drifted toward the faint outlines outside, and I tried to determine if the thing I'd seen earlier was still there, or if it had moved somewhere deeper, waiting to reveal itself again. The glass trembled, but not from the usual pressure. It trembled like something had brushed against the outside of the window with a deliberate testing touch. The streaks from earlier slid slightly, fresh moisture gathering at their edges, as if whatever caused them had returned. I backed toward the doorway, But before I reached it, the room's overhead speaker crackled softly. It wasn't an alarm, and it wasn't anyone calling in. It was a quiet static, uneven and shallow, like someone breathing close to a microphone but not speaking. The sound filled the observation deck with a strange tension, the sort that made your skin tighten and your instincts rise like a warning built into your bones. The static shifted in tone just enough to mimic the faint rhythm of something inhaling deeply, and the glass shivered in response, forming tiny spiderwebs of condensation along the interior surface. I gripped the doorway frame, feeling the edges bite into my palms, grounding me as the sound grew slightly clearer, almost as if trying to form words without finding the shape of them. Then all at once, the static stopped. The room fell into a silence so complete it felt engineered, like someone had switched off not just the sound system, but the concept of noise itself. Even the hum of the bass machinery seemed to fade, leaving only the thrum of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I didn't want to look toward the window again, but my eyes were drawn instinctively to the shifting dark outside. The shape was closer now, not clearly defined, but close enough that the water appeared to bend around it, distorting the background like a heat wave underwater. I leaned forward slightly, unable to stop myself, and in that moment I felt the pressure in the room increase, as if the thing outside had noticed the change in my attention. The lights flickered again, but didn't dim entirely, instead settling into a low, steady brightness that cast long shadows across the floor. The shadow near the glass elongated, stretching in a slow arc across the tiles, even though the shape outside hadn't moved any nearer. I realized with a sick twist that the shadow wasn't matching what I could see through the window. It was moving separately, as if it belonged to something inside the room rather than outside it. I held my breath, my eyes locked on the elongated smear of darkness inching toward me. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't loud, but it moved with purpose, changing shape subtly, like something crawling using limbs I couldn't see. I forced my legs into motion, stepping backward toward the hallway, but the shadow continued creeping, stretching longer and sharper, like a spear of darkness aimed directly at me. The moment my foot left the floor, the observation glass pulsed outward, a soft bulge forming as though the water had pushed against it with an enormous hand. I heard the faintest tremor in the structure, a sound like metal shifting under stress, not breaking but acknowledging the force behind it. The fog on the glass cleared in one long streak, revealing a faint outline of a face, pressed so close that the contours distorted into an almost human shape. The eyes, or where eyes should have been, looked hollow, wide and searching, examining me with a focus that felt deeply wrong. The shadow reached the doorway, just as I stepped through it, brushing the tip of my shoe with a coldness that seeped through the material like it had substance. I stumbled into the hallway, pulling the door shut with both hands, and the moment it closed, the glass panel on the door darkened completely. The shadow disappeared beneath the seam where the floor met the wall, retreating or dissolving, I couldn't tell which. I backed away until I pressed against the opposite wall, breathing hard, the residual cold in my shoe spreading up my leg like a slow burn. The lights in the corridor flickered, but didn't go out, giving me enough visibility to see the observation deck door trembling slightly, as if something inside had brushed against it again. I pushed myself upright, realizing the corridor ahead led deeper into the base, toward the storage rooms and emergency equipment lockers. A part of me wanted to run straight there, barricade myself behind metal drawers and supply crates until morning, but another part of me knew that hiding wasn't an option. Not when the thing outside, or inside, had shown interest in me. The corridor air felt heavy, thick with a dampness that hadn't been there earlier, and the faint scent of brine drifted through the ventilation system. It was the same smell that clung to divers after a long ascent, but sharper, almost metallic, like blood diluted in salt water. I took a slow step forward, testing the ground, expecting another shadow to slip beneath the lights, but the corridor remained empty, quiet, too quiet for a place that usually hummed lightly with machinery. I made my way toward the central hub of the base, each footstep muffled as if the floor insulation had thickened. Behind me, A faint tap sounded against the observation deck door, but I refused to turn around, knowing that looking back might reveal something I wasn't prepared to see. The tapping ceased after a few seconds, replaced by a long, low scrape that traveled down the door's surface. I quickened my pace, heart pounding, every instinct screaming that if I didn't keep moving, something would catch up to me. But just as I rounded the corner toward the main hallway, the base lights flickered once more, and a cold draft rolled across my shoulders like a hand settling gently on my back. The cold draft slid over my shoulders, like a breath that didn't belong to anything human. And I froze mid-step as the words of Rule 5, "Never walk toward a cold draft unless you can see the source," surfaced in my mind. The air carried a damp chill, sharper than anything the ventilation system could produce, and it felt directed, like someone exhaling slowly against the back of my neck. I turned just enough to glance over my shoulder, careful not to face the corridor fully, afraid of what might be waiting there. The hallway behind me stretched empty, but the draft kept flowing, steady and deliberate, coming from a point I couldn't see. My fingers tightened against the railing on the wall, bracing myself against an instinct that tugged me forward even as the rule begged me to stay still. I forced myself to look away from the corridor and back toward the main hub, knowing that the only safe direction was forward. The draft strengthened as though reacting to my decision, brushing the side of my face like a cold hand sliding across my jaw. I stepped forward anyway, keeping my gaze fixed on the lights ahead, watching them flicker in strange rhythmic patterns. The base always had its quirks: pressure fluctuations, electrical dips, metal fatigue, but this wasn't random. Each flicker dimmed in the direction of the cold air, as if something unseen occupied that space and disrupted the light. I moved faster, trying to ignore the heaviness in my legs as the draft followed, curling around my ankles in thin, icy coils. Halfway down the hallway, the lights stabilized, and the air warmed just enough for breath to return to my lungs. The draft stopped entirely, cut off like a door closing on a whisper. I leaned against the wall and exhaled, my breath shaky, my pulse thudding hard through my chest. For a moment I allowed myself to believe I had outrun whatever had created that cold current, but the silence in the corridor felt wrong, too absolute, too expectant. The bass usually hummed faintly beneath everything: machinery, filtration systems, generators, but now the only sound was my breathing, echoing ahead of me like soft footsteps. I pushed off the wall and continued forward, not wanting to stay in that unnatural quiet any longer than necessary. The main hub's circular entryway glowed ahead, but the door stood partially open, the seal lights around its frame flickering amber instead of their usual stable green. I approached cautiously, placing my hand against the cold metal and nudging it wider. The room beyond was lit, but dimly, the overhead bulbs casting long, wavering shadows across the floor. I stepped inside, listening for the familiar hum of consoles and monitors, but everything sounded muted, as if the electronics were straining against something unseen. A faint tapping echoed from one of the side rooms, but unlike the observation deck, this sound wasn't testing or searching. It was rhythmic, steady, like someone working on a pipe with deliberate patience. I circled the perimeter of the hub, staying close to the walls, scanning each doorway for movement. The tapping grew clearer as I neared the storage alcove, and the steady repetition made my skin tighten. It didn't sound mechanical, and it didn't match any repair cadence I recognized. It was too slow, too measured, like someone gently signaling for attention. I hesitated near the alcove's threshold, my breath held tight, trying to decide whether to look inside or keep moving. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint scrape that traveled downward along the wall. I stepped back instantly, heart twisting, imagining fingers trailing along metal, dragging slowly as they descended to the floor. I turned away from the alcove and headed toward the central console, hoping to check the interior cams for anything that might explain the strange sounds. The screens flickered as I approached, some displaying static, others showing the same corner of the same hallway from different angles, as if the feed had looped or someone had rerouted the input. One monitor showed a corridor I recognized, the one I had just walked through, but the shadows on the screen were wrong. A dark smear clung to the ceiling, unmoving but shaped almost like a person flattened against the metal. Limbs pressed outward in angles that didn't match any human posture. I blinked hard, thinking it was a distortion, but the shape remained, anchored there as the hallway lights below it flickered faintly. I backed away from the console slowly, unwilling to take my eyes off the screen, until I knew it wouldn't move. The shape didn't shift or stretch. It stayed perfectly still, almost patient, almost waiting. A quiet thud sounded behind me, soft but close, and I whipped around instinctively. One of the supply crates had tipped over near the far wall, its contents spilling out in a scattered pattern that didn't match the fall. The items had spread in a semicircle, too neatly, as if placed rather than tossed. A single wet footprint marked the center of the ark, darker than the rest of the floor, gleaming under the dim overhead lights. The print was elongated, wide at the arch, narrowing at the toe, like someone with webbed feet had stepped there moments ago. My pulse surged, and I moved backward until my calves touched the edge of the central console. Another faint draft brushed against my hand, subtle but unmistakable, and I felt my fingers tense as the cold spiraled across my skin. This time, the source of the draft came from the vent above the supply crates, but something about it felt wrong. The vent slats weren't oscillating the way they usually did when air passed through. They were completely still, unmoving, as the cold air seeped out in a slow, unnatural flow. I stared at the vent, waiting to see if any shadow shifted behind the slats, but nothing moved. The draft continued, quiet, steady, purposeful. I turned slowly, scanning the rest of the hub for any sign that the presence had followed me here. The main door remained open behind me, the corridor beyond still and faintly lit. For a moment, I considered rushing back into the hallway and heading straight for the crew quarters, thinking safety might come from proximity to other people. But then I remembered the observation deck, the shadow under the door, the footprints that led nowhere. I wasn't convinced that being near anyone else would help. Whatever was moving through the base wasn't limited by rooms or doors or common sense. It chose where to appear based on something I didn't understand yet. The console lights flickered again, drawing my attention back to the screens. The hallway feed changed abruptly, this time showing the corridor leading to the dive bay. The view was empty at first, calm and motionless. Then as the camera adjusted focus, a blurry shape drifted into frame from the far right. It moved like water pouring into a space that shouldn't hold it, smooth, slow, almost graceful. As it settled into the center of the hallway, the air in the hub shifted, rippling gently against my face, like the warning that precedes a breaking wave. The shape hovered in the feed for a moment before sliding toward the camera, its outline sharpening as it approached, forming a suggestion of limbs, a torso, a head tilted slightly to the side, as if listening. I stepped back instinctively, even though the thing was only on the screen. Its movement felt too real, too deliberate, too aware. The figure reached the camera and leaned close, filling the frame with a dark blur, and then the screen went black. All the monitors followed, one by one, shutting off in rapid sequence until the hub plunged into semi-darkness. The only light came from the weak emergency strips along the floor, casting thin bands of blue across the room that made every shadow look twice as tall. I held my breath, listening for movement, but the air had gone still again. No draft, no tapping, no scrape. That silence terrified me more than anything. And then from somewhere behind the storage alcove, something let out a slow, drawn-out exhale. The moment I descended past the broken catwalk that marked the border of the abandoned shaft, I reminded myself of Rule 6. Never dive toward a light that appears below you in total darkness. The trench beyond the base wasn't just deep, it felt alive, holding the kind of weight that pressed against your chest and made every breath a struggle. My helmet lamp barely cut through the blackness, and the water around me seemed almost viscous, swallowing sound, swallowing motion, making it impossible to trust anything my eyes thought they saw. Even a flicker of light could be a trick, a lure, or something far worse waiting to test the limits of a diver's instinct. I gripped the ladder tighter, forcing my mind to focus, but the soft, impossible glow flickered again, teasing me from depths I wasn't supposed to approach. I had first heard about this phenomenon during my training, when instructors warned about the phantom glows that sometimes appear deep in the trench. They described lights that don't follow the normal rules of physics, flickers that float upward against the current, glimmers that mirror your own movements, and colors that pulse unnaturally, just enough to seem real. Those who chased the lights rarely returned, and the few who did came back silent, eyes hollow, never willing to describe the shape they saw beneath them. The instructors said it wasn't curiosity that killed divers, but the compulsion, the irresistible draw that tricks the mind into thinking the light is a way back when it is a trap. I tried to push their warnings aside, telling myself stories were exaggerated, but now, staring at the faint shimmer below me, I felt the truth in my bones. I moved slowly across the ladder, letting the deep-sea pressure press against my shoulders, reminding me how fragile we humans are in these waters. The light below me pulsed again, brighter this time, and I could feel the temperature around it drop slightly, though the water shouldn't shift that way in this section. I adjusted the lamp on my helmet, trying to illuminate the tunnel walls, the twisted metal, the jagged rocks, anything that would confirm reality. But no matter how I angled it, the light beneath me remained untouched by my own beam, glowing faintly, beckoning with a presence that felt sentient. My heart thumped faster, and I realized how quickly panic could make a diver's logic unravel. I considered turning back, climbing toward the catwalk, and abandoning the descent, but part of me, the part trained to solve problems, to follow procedure, to gather data, resisted. What if the light indicated an actual structural anomaly? What if ignoring it meant leaving something dangerous unreported? My hands trembled as I weighed the two options, caught between the instinct to survive and the drive to complete my mission. I adjusted my grip on the ladder and decided to descend a little further, just enough to get a clearer look without fully committing. Even as I told myself that, a knot of dread coiled in my stomach, twisting tighter with every passing second. The glow shifted slightly as I descended, and the water around it rippled, though there was no current strong enough to do that. I squinted, trying to discern its edges, and the moment I focused, it seemed to shrink away, like a living thing avoiding direct scrutiny. I whispered to myself, warning me not to move toward it, to keep the rule in mind, and still, some deep animal part of me pulled downward. I could feel my training fighting against instinct, every muscle screaming to resist, but the light flickered again, closer this time, impossibly fast. I blinked, and the shimmer seemed almost within reach. The deeper I looked, the more the tunnel behind me seemed to fade into black, as if the ocean itself was erasing my path back. I reached a point where my boots hovered over a metal grate leading into the shaft, and the light shivered beneath me. It pulsed rhythmically, almost breathing, moving in subtle swirls that defied my understanding of how water and light behaved. It wasn't stationary, but it wasn't swimming either. It was deliberate, patient, aware of me. I thought of Rule 6 again, the instructor's warnings, the lost divers, the hollow-eyed survivors. A cold realization settled in. Curiosity here wasn't just dangerous, it was fatal. Every instinct screamed to turn, to climb back, but my muscles betrayed me, flexing toward the impossible glow. I tried to fight it, telling myself the rule existed for a reason, and yet a deeper, darker force tugged at me like a chain through the water. I peered down into the blackness below, seeing the faint outlines of the shaft walls dissolve into nothing. The glow began to elongate, stretching downward, as if trying to guide me along some invisible path. I froze, mid-ladder, my fingers tightening on the cold metal. I could feel the pressure of the water increasing, not just physically, but psychologically, pressing into the marrow of my bones. The glow pulsed once, sharply, and I saw movement within it, subtle shifts, as if the light contained something waiting, breathing, observing. I swallowed hard, knowing I was close to the point where curiosity could kill me. The sensation of eyes upon me intensified. Not my own reflection in the helmet glass, not the monitors back at the base, but something far larger, far older, aware beneath the water. The light shimmered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw a silhouette within it, long limbs that didn't bend like human arms, a torso wider than any diver, and something that might have been a face, but no features I could name. My breath hitched, my pulse racing, and every fiber in me screamed to climb back, to escape. But the glow wasn't just a light anymore, it was a lure, and I was already too close. I took one careful step off the ladder, lowering myself toward the shaft's mouth, but immediately regretted it. The glow reacted, splitting into multiple flickers, circling me in the water like a living thing. My training screamed at me to stop, to ascend, to obey Rule 6. But the rhythm of the pulsing lights seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat, dragging me further down despite my mind's warnings. I tried to push myself backward, toward the catwalk, but the water seemed to resist, holding me just long enough to test my resolve. Panic began to rise, curling into nausea, as the glow pulsed once more with a deliberate, almost mocking brightness. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the ladder above, and the moment I did, the glow recoiled, vanishing into the darkness below. The pressure lifted slightly, the blackness returned to its ordinary emptiness, but the memory of what I had glimpsed remained. I clung to the ladder, shivering in more ways than one, heart hammering, as the shadows seemed to stretch along the shaft walls. I had obeyed Rule 6, barely, but I knew the ocean remembered, that whatever had drawn the light would be back, patient, waiting for the next mistake. I climbed back toward the catwalk, each rung a relief, each breath a reminder of survival. When I finally reached the top, the base's structure felt solid beneath my hands again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the abyss had followed me, pressing against the metal, testing its strength. My helmet lamp scanned the water below one last time, but the glow was gone. Only the memory remained, sharp, insistent, a warning that some lights are not meant to be chased. And somewhere deep below, I knew it watched, still pulsing, still waiting. I froze at the edge of the catwalk, my eyes scanning the black expanse below, remembering Rule 7, never attempt to retrieve objects that drift toward you from the deep. The abyss felt alive tonight, pressing against every surface of the base, like it had a will of its own. From the darkness I saw the first object, a small metallic cylinder, faintly glinting under my helmet lamp, slowly rising toward the catwalk as if carried by invisible hands. My gut twisted. I knew better than to reach for it, yet my mind argued that a recovered piece could provide answers, evidence that the anomalies weren't just hallucinations. Still, the instinct to obey the rule clawed at me, warning that the water below wasn't just cold, it was predatory. The cylinder drifted closer, rotating in a hypnotic, uneven motion, and I noticed faint etchings along its surface that looked almost like symbols, alien in their design. Each second it floated closer, the surrounding water thickened, moving sluggishly, as though the abyss itself slowed to observe my reaction. I leaned back from the edge, gripping the railing, telling myself I was watching a trick of the light or a current anomaly. But the object's ascent was too deliberate, too controlled, and the air, or what passed for air in my helmet, felt tighter, like someone holding it just out of reach. My breathing became shallow, aware that a single misstep could drag me into that dark swirl. I remembered the stories the older divers told, the cautionary tales about curiosity killing trained professionals, a bracelet, a tool, a piece of debris, all drifting from nowhere and disappearing into the hands of someone foolish enough to reach. They never returned from attempts to claim the floating objects. One diver had tried to retrieve a small corroded camera, believing it contained data on a collapsed substation. The light it emitted was blinding, and the last anyone heard, he screamed into the comms as his suit dragged him downward, deeper than the cameras could follow. I clenched my teeth and told myself not to become another cautionary tale, though my curiosity screamed against reason. A shadow moved beneath the cylinder, faint but distinct, stretching like an elongated hand toward it, or perhaps using it as bait. I froze in horror, realizing that whatever was guiding the object wasn't visible through my helmet lamp. It wasn't a current, and it wasn't machinery. It had intelligence. The cylinder rotated unnaturally, as if it were testing me, tempting me to break the rule. I felt a cold prickle along the back of my neck, the same sensation I had felt when the phantom light below me had pulsed. My muscles tensed, every nerve screaming that this wasn't something I could rationalize. It was a test, a lure, and breaking Rule 7 would be a mistake I could never undo. I backed away from the edge, keeping my eyes fixed on the cylinder as it drifted ever closer to the catwalk. The water around it shimmered with faint bioluminescent flickers, casting shadows on the base walls that weren't there a moment before. It was as though the object carried a small fragment of life with it, something that shouldn't exist at this depth. My instincts told me to run, to climb back into the main hub, but my legs felt heavy, stiffened by fear and fatigue. I had to wait, to let the cylinder pass, to let the abyss take what it was offering and leave me untouched. Every second it floated closer made the hair on my arms rise. Then I noticed movement from above, from the catwalk railings I had just climbed. Something small and slick, almost indistinguishable in the dim light, slid toward the cylinder. I froze completely. The object hesitated for a fraction of a second, and the movement above seemed to mirror my own hesitation. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud against the silent pressurized water around me. The cylinder didn't rise any further. It seemed anchored, waiting, and I realized with horror that I had stumbled into the same trap the older divers had described. The abyss didn't just lure objects, it tested who dared to claim them. I held my breath as the cylinder paused at the edge of the catwalk, nearly within reach. My hand twitched toward it, despite my better judgment, the pull almost magnetic. I shook my head violently, forcing myself back, remembering every warning ever given about Rule 7. The shadow beneath it pulsed slightly, darkening as if annoyed by my resistance, stretching longer into the trench, as if to remind me it was watching, always watching. I realized the object wasn't the danger, it was the attention it carried, the intelligence behind the water, deciding which rules I would obey and which I would test. Finally, the cylinder slowly drifted back downward, as if released by an unseen hand, sinking into the darkness from which it had risen. Relief flooded me, but it was shallow and fleeting. The moment it disappeared, I felt the pressure of the trench all around me intensify, as though the abyss had noticed my hesitation and wanted to mark its awareness. My breathing came faster now, shallow, and I struggled to steady my helmet lamp, which flickered faintly in response. I couldn't afford another misstep, not with the unseen intelligence below me, not with the rules hanging in my mind like warnings written in blood. I backed away from the catwalk completely, stepping toward the service ladder that would lead me back to the hub. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the abyss itself resisted my movement, trying to test my obedience to Rule 7 one final time. I glanced back once more at the descending cylinder, and though it was gone, a faint shimmer remained where it had been, like the water itself remembered its passage. I shivered violently and gripped the ladder with both hands, telling myself not to look again, not to linger. The rules existed for a reason, and Rule 7 was clear. Retrieving drifting objects was not just reckless, it was fatal. As I climbed back to the catwalk and toward the hub, my mind replayed every lesson about the abyss, every warning about objects that appear from nowhere. The cylinder might have been a tool, a piece of debris, or something else entirely, but it had tested me, and I had survived only because I remembered the rule. The water around the base felt calmer now, but I knew it was only patience, biding its time until the next lapse. The cold of the trench seemed to follow me upward, brushing against my suit like a reminder that Rule 7 was still alive, still watching, still waiting for the moment someone forgot. When I finally reached the hub, the base lights greeted me with familiar hums and flickers, and I felt almost safe. Yet the cylinder, and the intelligence guiding it, lingered in my mind. Every shadow in the corridors seemed alive now, every flicker of light a potential lure, every draft a test. I understood for the first time that obeying the rules wasn't about compliance, it was about survival, and any lapse, no matter how small, could lead to the abyss reclaiming what it wanted. My pulse gradually slowed, but my eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the observation windows, knowing that the deep always remembers the curious, and Rule 7 is unforgiving. As I approached the far end of the hub, my eyes drifted toward the metal bulkhead that led to the old maintenance sector, the part of the base everyone whispered about, but no one entered willingly. I forced myself to remember Rule 8, never enter areas marked unsafe, even if the base commands you, repeating it silently like a prayer. The warning lights on the bulkhead flickered weakly, barely illuminating the hazard stripes painted across its surface, and I could feel the familiar tension in the air, as though the very space was aware of my proximity. A faint hum of machinery echoed from behind the door, irregular and uneven, unlike any operational hum I had heard in the rest of the base. My hands hovered over the keypad, tempted by the thought that the base might have a valid reason, but fear held me back, reminding me that the abyss beyond didn't follow logic. I stepped closer, scanning the metal floor beneath my boots for any signs of instability, and a draft curled along the walls, colder than any ventilation could produce. The door handle creaked slightly under the pressure, as if something beneath the bulkhead stirred in anticipation of my choice. A warning light above flickered red and then amber, irregular enough to suggest a malfunction or a trap. My helmet lamp highlighted the scratches along the doorway edges, fresh and deep, like claws marking a passage. The longer I stood there, the more I could feel an almost sentient weight pressing down from the maintenance area, a presence waiting for someone foolish enough to ignore the rule. I leaned back instinctively, trying to rationalize why the base might have needed me there. Perhaps a minor pressure leak, a collapsed conduit, or a malfunctioning sensor. Any of these could explain the command to enter the restricted zone, yet the deep-sea experience whispered otherwise. The stories of divers who had gone into marked unsafe areas came rushing back. Suits ripped, lights extinguished mid-shift, crew members disappearing without record. I remembered how the water seemed thicker in those zones, how shadows lingered longer than they should, and how sounds behaved differently, stretching and warping into something almost intelligible. Every instinct in my body told me to obey Rule 8, to leave the sector alone, yet the base's command felt like an invisible force, pulling me toward the door. A sudden vibration ran through the floor beneath me, soft at first, then stronger, like the base itself exhaling in warning. I pressed my palms against the bulkhead, feeling the cold metal hum under my touch. The vibration followed an irregular pattern, as though something below the maintenance sector was pacing, aware of my hesitation. I took a step back, heart hammering, recalling every story of a diver whose curiosity outweighed caution, only to vanish into darkness that the base would never explain. The hum changed tone as I moved, almost as if it was responding to my presence, a silent conversation I was not equipped to understand. My head swiveled toward the keypad, debating if I would defy the rule or obey it, and risk appearing insubordinate to the base's command system. I heard a soft, wet scrape echoing from within the restricted area, too deliberate to be random, and my pulse spiked. The sound moved slowly along the walls, curling around the pipes, pausing as though it were studying my reaction. I realized then that the area wasn't just unsafe structurally, it was unsafe in ways the base could never explain. Even if the hull was intact, even if the lights above were functioning, some presence claimed the space. My hand hovered over the keypad, frozen, as the scrape continued, spreading its rhythm through the bulkhead. I forced myself to step back, resisting the temptation to enter, feeling a pressure in my chest, like the sector itself was aware of my defiance. The door handle shifted slightly under my observation, though no one touched it, and the warning lights pulsed red, irregularly, like the heartbeat of the unseen presence inside. I recalled the advice of the older divers: entering marked unsafe zones was never about human error. It was about something that waited, calculating. Those who went in too bravely often vanished, sometimes leaving behind faint, waterlogged imprints on the walls, or tools drifting slowly upward in the shaft with inexplicable markings. I pressed my helmet back, trying to steady my breathing, and felt the corridor behind me tighten, the lights above flickering in response to my hesitation. The base seemed alive tonight, aware of my every move, and the thought of stepping into the restricted sector made my stomach churn. A chill passed across my neck, stronger than any draft, as if a hand traced the line of my collar. I stumbled slightly, gripping the bulkhead for stability, and the vibration beneath me intensified. For a moment I could have sworn I saw faint shapes shifting just beyond the threshold, indistinct but distinctly humanoid in form, crouched or leaning against walls that weren't mine to inspect. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching toward me with patient precision. My pulse raced. I whispered to myself again, Rule 8, over and over, trying to convince my body to obey, to retreat. The presence waited, unhurried, like an apex predator aware of its prey's next choice. Finally, I forced myself to step away from the door, moving toward the main hub with deliberate slowness, every nerve screaming. The corridor ahead felt safer only in comparison, the faint hum of standard machinery offering comfort that the restricted sector lacked. Even as I increased my distance, I felt the pull of that sector, a magnetic insistence, as if the base itself wanted me to step in. I ignored it, forcing each step, listening to the scrape that had ceased moments ago now echo faintly in my mind, not in the corridor itself. The sense of eyes or of attention lingered long after I had put space between me and the door. When I finally reached the main hub, I exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar pressure of the controlled environment press against me like a blanket. My fingers shook as I removed my gloves, the memory of the restricted sector still vivid in my mind. I realized then that the rule wasn't just about obedience, it was about survival. The base may command, alarms may signal, and curiosity may urge, but some areas are marked unsafe for reasons beyond human understanding. Rule 8 was clear. Entering them invites attention from forces that do not negotiate or forgive. And as I settled near the hub console, watching the shadows dance along the walls, I knew the sector's gaze had not left me, silently reminding me that defiance carries a price. As I stepped into the dimly lit corridor, connecting the main hub to the living quarters, I reminded myself of Rule 9. Never acknowledge the whispers that come from empty rooms. The air felt heavier here, stagnant, yet somehow vibrating with anticipation, carrying a faint hum that might have been machinery or something else entirely. I slowed my pace, straining to hear the usual environmental sounds. But beneath the constant thrum of the bass, there was something different. Low, breathy murmurs drifted from the storage room ahead, too soft to understand, yet distinct enough to suggest language, or at least intent. My instinct screamed to ignore it, yet every nerve in my body twitched, as though the whispers were aware of my hesitation. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself that these whispers were an auditory hallucination, born of exhaustion. But the closer I walked to the storage room, the clearer they became. Each syllable was distorted, echoing unnaturally in the air, bending around corners, circling me. I wanted to cover my ears, to shut out the sound, but something deeper inside me wanted to answer, to respond, to reason with the presence that spoke without showing itself. I shook my head violently, reminding myself of Rule 9, and forced my legs to keep moving past the threshold without acknowledging the source. The storage room door loomed ahead, ajar, revealing only blackness inside, yet the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to crawl along the floor, climb the walls, and curl into the ceiling ducts, twisting around the corners in impossible patterns. I thought of the last time a crew member had mentioned hearing voices in the base. Someone so desperate for contact they had opened the door, stepped inside, and vanished. The official reports claimed a sudden structural collapse, a miscommunication of air pressure, but those of us who knew better understood. The whispers were not harmless. They were the first step of a selection. a test of attention, of will and survival. I quickened my pace, trying to pass the room without making eye contact or sound, but my own presence seemed to amplify the murmurs. The words were still unintelligible, but their cadence matched my heartbeat, tugging at my thoughts, planting the suggestion that I should turn, that I should respond. My helmet lamp flickered as if in reaction, casting shadows along the walls that danced unnaturally, elongated and stretched, creating figures that were almost human. Each flicker made the whispers louder in my mind, a constant reminder that attention was deadly, that acknowledgement of them, any acknowledgement, was forbidden. I stopped at the end of the corridor near the lounge, pressing my palms to the cold metal of the wall to steady myself. The whispers seemed to linger at the door behind me, curling out like smoke through the gaps. My training urged me not to listen, not to turn my head, not to respond, yet the base felt alive tonight, vibrating with a tension that made compliance feel insufficient. I remembered the warnings. Even a thought spoken aloud, even a glance, could invite something into your space that the base could not contain. I gritted my teeth, feeling my pulse hammer in my ears, and forced myself to walk past the doorway without acknowledging a single syllable. A sudden draft carried through the corridor, bringing with it a faint sour scent, metallic and briny, and the whispers grew closer, wrapping around my consciousness like fine thread. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the familiar flicker of the lounge lights ahead, but the room seemed to stretch, elongating unnaturally, pulling me toward it. My hands tightened around the edges of the wall as the whispers grew more insistent, almost questioning, almost human. I forced myself to move, each step deliberate, counting my breaths, counting my heartbeat, repeating Rule 9, silently to anchor myself in obedience. I finally reached the lounge, the familiar hum of the main system soothing in contrast to the distorted rhythm behind me. The whispers didn't follow directly. They lingered at the corridor's edge, soft but persistent, like something aware of my every action. I sank into a chair near the console, trying to steady my racing pulse, feeling the presence at the doorway, watching, testing, waiting. The memory of Rule 9 resonated deeply. Acknowledgement was survival. Ignoring was survival. Hesitation was death. I understood then that the whispers weren't random. They selected, they studied, they tempted, and they never forgot those who faltered. Even as I adjusted my helmet lamp and returned to monitoring the base feeds, I could feel the corridor behind me alive with intention. Every shadow seemed to twitch. Every corner seemed deeper, and my mind replayed the whispers over and over. I refused to acknowledge them, refused to answer, and yet the memory of their sound pressed into my consciousness. The base itself seemed to resonate with the warnings, reminding me that obeying Rule 9 wasn't just a guideline, it was a shield thin and fragile, against something older, smarter and far more patient than I could imagine. When I finally allowed myself a slow breath, the whispers seemed to retreat, curling back into the shadows, leaving only the faintest residual echo in the air. But the tension remained, a subtle weight pressing down on the lounge, on my shoulders, on every fiber of my being. I knew they had not left, only waited for another lapse, another moment of curiosity, another glance toward the empty room. Rule 9 had kept me safe this time, but the abyss, the base, and the shadows that whispered would not forgive a second failure. I stepped cautiously along the damp metal corridor, glancing at the shallow puddles forming near the maintenance hatches, and reminded myself of Rule 10. Never trust reflections in water that shouldn't be there. The base had never been perfectly sealed. Condensation always pooled in low areas, creating mirrors of liquid that seemed harmless. Tonight, though, the reflections moved oddly, bending with the faint flicker of my helmet lamp, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow detach from the reflection, lurking just beyond the puddle. My chest tightened, pulse spiking as I forced my gaze downward, and stepped carefully, keeping my lamp aimed at the walls and floors rather than the shimmering water. I remembered the first warning about this rule, shared by an old diver who had survived only by instinct. He described puddles that showed not what was but what could be, twisted, altered versions of yourself that mimic movements a second too late, or eyes that appear where none should exist. Those who looked too long, even for a second, reported losing track of reality, sometimes reaching into the puddles and vanishing as the water seemed to pull them in. I shivered at the memory, recalling how his hands shook as he described a reflection raising a hand before he had moved, mirroring intentions with horrifying precision. My mind warned me not to linger, yet I couldn't entirely avert my eyes, aware that even a quick glance was enough to provoke the abyss. As I passed a small shallow pool near the bulkhead, the reflection of the corridor behind me shifted strangely. The walls seemed taller, darker, and the shadows of the piping twisted unnaturally. My reflection stepped slightly ahead of my actual body, leaning forward in a way that my muscles had not allowed. I froze, trying to ignore it, pressing my palms against the corridor wall to steady myself. The puddle seemed to ripple in response to my tension, like it was alive, aware, teasing my perception. I whispered to myself that I would not be tricked, repeating the rule like a lifeline, but every instinct screamed that the water carried something older. Waiting for the moment, I faltered. The corridor widened near the junction to the dive bay, and puddles here were deeper, catching the dim light from overhead fixtures. I noticed multiple reflections, some my own, some shapes that didn't match any part of the base or my body. One seemed to crouch low, elongated, staring at me with eyes too black to be human. I felt my throat tighten, my stomach twisting, and I took deliberate steps to avoid the pools, keeping my lamp trained on the walls instead of the mirrored water. The reflections pulsed slightly, shadows stretching longer than they should, bending over themselves as if they were breathing in sync with my heartbeat. Obeying the rule was not just a choice, it was survival. A trickle of water ran along the edge of the floor, carrying tiny ripples that distorted the reflections in unpredictable ways. The images moved independently now, no longer synchronized with my own actions. For a split second, I thought I saw myself lying prone, trapped beneath the puddle, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. My pulse raced, and I forced myself to take a deep breath, gripping the railing along the wall. Rule 10 echoed in my mind, a warning etched in blood and experience. Nothing in these puddles could be trusted. Nothing was as it seemed, and looking too closely could invite the abyss into my mind. I kept moving forward, carefully placing each foot, counting my breaths, maintaining control over my fear. The reflections seemed to respond, stretching, bending and flickering in ways that mocked my efforts. One puddle, wider than the rest, suddenly shimmered with a soft, eerie glow, revealing shapes that weren't mine at all. Long, thin limbs moved beneath the surface, folding and twisting impossibly, and I could feel the pull of curiosity trying to drag me closer. I forced my gaze away, forcing my body to obey the rule, my mind repeating it like a mantra. Survival depends on ignoring the lure of what shouldn't exist. The corridor narrowed again, and condensation dripped steadily from the ceiling, creating new ripples in the puddles below. Each distorted reflection seemed to crawl along the floor, elongating toward me, as if testing my resolve. I could hear my own shallow breathing, each exhale carrying tension through the helmet, and I imagined the reflections mimicking not just my movement, but my intent. The deeper into the base I moved, the more aware I became that these puddles were alive, patient, waiting for me to falter. One misstep, one glance too long, and the abyss lurking in the reflections would claim me without hesitation. A small room ahead housed a maintenance hatch partially submerged in water, reflecting my helmet light. The puddle here was darker, as if it absorbed light rather than reflected it. I approached cautiously, shivering, and saw my reflection move its head before I did. Panic shot through me, and my hand shook as I reached for the hatch lever, then froze. I realized that if I acted on instinct, if I trusted what I saw, the reflections might ensnare me. I gripped the lever, but refused to look at the puddle, forcing my movements to be mechanical and precise. Every fiber of my being reminded me of Rule 10, that any hesitation, any trust in what shouldn't exist, was a sentence the abyss would enforce. The puddles became more numerous as I entered the dive bay corridor. Each one reflected more than the base's metal surfaces. Some hinted at shapes in the darkness beyond the walls, silhouettes I hadn't noticed in the physical space. I forced myself to keep my helmet lamp focused ahead, moving quickly yet carefully, each step measured, breathing shallow but controlled. Shadows stretched unnaturally, twisted with the distorted reflections, creating fleeting images that disappeared when I tried to focus. I felt eyes everywhere, though I knew no one was there, and I reminded myself repeatedly that obedience to the rule meant I would survive this section, while curiosity could trap me forever in the mirrored water. Finally, I reached the junction near the main hub, where the puddles began to thin. The reflections here were less distorted, but I still avoided them, keeping my gaze on the walls and the floor ahead. My legs shook from tension, adrenaline, and fear, and I realized how close I had come to being trapped by the water's illusions. The shadows that had flickered alongside me seemed to retreat slightly, acknowledging that I had obeyed, survived, and respected the warning. The memory of the shimmering puddles, the twisted figures beneath the water, and the eerie synchronization with my movements would haunt me, a reminder that Rule 10 was not just guidance, it was a barrier between life and the deep, hungry abyss. Even as I reached the main hub, the corridor behind me seemed alive with memory. I could feel the lingering pull of the puddles, the subtle weight of the reflections in my mind. I exhaled slowly, every muscle trembling, knowing the rule had saved me once again. I understood now that the water, the reflections, and the abyss all remembered those who faltered. Any misstep, any trust in what shouldn't exist, would be immediate, irreversible. Rule 10 had been my shield, fragile and tenuous, and as I stepped into the hub proper, I realized that obeying it tonight had meant the difference between returning to consciousness and vanishing into the mirrored depths forever. I paused at the observation deck, my helmet lamp casting pale circles over the metal floor, and reminded myself of Rule 11. Never leave the base alone once you hear the final signal. The rule wasn't written in any manual, yet every senior diver whispered it with reverence, as though the final signal wasn't just a sound but a verdict. Tonight, the hum of the machinery shifted. A low, resonant vibration spread through the floor, rhythmic, deliberate, like a heartbeat echoing from the deepest recesses of the trench. My pulse quickened instantly, each thump in my chest answering the vibrations as if in acknowledgement. I knew instinctively that this was the signal, the one that meant everything had changed. I gripped the railing, scanning the dimly lit corridors behind me. The observation deck felt exposed, every shadow exaggerated, stretching toward me with intent. A distant panel flickered to life, displaying a distorted view of the lower shafts I had traversed, but nothing moved, yet everything felt watched. The vibration grew stronger, and I could hear faint metallic clicks from the bulkheads, like someone or something was pacing, counting, waiting. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to recall every rule, every warning, every instinctive hesitation that had kept me alive this long. Leaving now would mean breaking Rule 11, and I knew instinctively that the consequences would be immediate. The hum shifted again, descending in tone until it became almost unbearable, pressing against my eardrums and reverberating through my bones. I realized then that the final signal wasn't just a warning, it was a summoning. Every light in the base flickered in rhythm with it, and shadows along the walls seemed to pulse in harmony, stretching and bending in impossible ways. I stepped back cautiously, my gloves scraping along the railing as I tried to anchor myself to something solid. Somewhere deep in the base, a hatch opened without sound, revealing darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow the vibration whole, and I could feel the pull of it, as if the abyss itself wanted me to descend. I considered retreating to the central hub, thinking the presence might be confined to the observation deck, but the vibration spread through every floor, every corridor, every metal joint. My mind screamed at me to obey the rule. Stay put, don't venture alone, don't become prey to the timing of the final signal. A faint whisper reached my ears, impossibly clear over the mechanical hum, yet no one was there. It's time, it breathed. a voice that carried both threat and certainty, and I froze, aware that stepping even a single foot alone beyond the deck could mean being claimed. The abyss had already tested me, and the final signal was its declaration. The choice to leave was no longer mine. I crouched low near the railing, hugging the metal, and tried to focus on the console lights before me. The view of the lower shafts shifted again, and I glimpsed the shapes of the corridors I had traversed, shadows stretching unnaturally, bending toward unseen exits. The vibration intensified, making the metal floor beneath me tremble with almost sentient insistence. I could see faint pulses of light moving through the water outside the base's windows, not random flashes but deliberate, guided, almost communicative. Every instinct screamed that leaving now would be fatal, that obedience to Rule 11 meant more than survival, it meant acknowledgement of the abyss's dominance. I could hear faint, wet scraping from the maintenance sector, the same sound I had encountered earlier, but this time it wasn't distant. It echoed across every corridor, merging with the vibration and the whispered voice, creating a chorus of dread that filled every space. The base felt alive, bending, breathing, closing around me, and I realized that I had no path for retreat. The final signal demanded presence, vigilance, and obedience, and any step alone would make me prey. I pressed myself closer to the console, the cold metal burning through my gloves, heart hammering as the vibration grew into a resonance I could feel in my very bones. Minutes passed, though time seemed meaningless under the influence of the signal. The shadows moved subtly along the walls, never leaving the edges of my vision, keeping me tense, alert, aware of the fine line I walked between obedience and disaster. I could see other consoles flicker to life briefly, lights dancing in patterns, too deliberate to be mechanical, too rhythmic to be random. Somewhere in the depth of the base, a door slammed shut, metal rattling violently, and I realized it wasn't a mechanism. It was a warning, a reminder of Rule 11 and the consequences of stepping beyond my bounds. Every instinct I had ever trained into myself told me to stay, to remain exactly where I was, and I obeyed, every heartbeat a testament to my survival. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed, and the final signal gradually diminished into a low hum that resonated only in the floor, not the air. I dared not move from my post, still crouched near the console, eyes glued to the darkened corridors, aware that any sudden action could trigger the presence again. The whispers had ceased, the vibration had lessened, yet the weight of its intent remained, pressing upon me in a silent reminder that the base itself, the water outside, the shadows and reflections, they all remembered. Rule 11 was the culmination of all the other rules. Disobedience at this stage meant instant judgment. Obedience, however, meant survival, at least until the next test. I finally allowed myself a slow, careful breath, my body trembling but alive. The lights stabilized, the consoles hummed their normal rhythm, and the observation deck seemed almost safe again. Yet, as I glanced toward the lower shafts one final time, I could see faint shadows lingering in the corners, patient and waiting. The final signal had passed, but its memory, its insistence, had not. Rule 11 had held me here tonight, alive, aware and fully conscious that the abyss below, and the base itself, would always be ready for the next lapse. I leaned back against the railing, exhausted, knowing that survival required more than strength. It required vigilance, obedience, and understanding the cost of ignoring the rules. The abyss waited, always. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.